Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is History 121, American History from 1875 to the present. Uh, we were a little bit behind, I know, on the schedule. We've had some issues with technology, things of that nature. We're back up and running, and we're all the happier for it. Want to go ahead and take a look at some of the readings for Chapter 3 today. And Chapter 3 talks about the rise of industrialization and the rise of a new immigration in American history. Um, One thing to keep in mind as we talk about this, and remember, my lectures are supplementary to our reading materials and we'll add into it. Uh, Immigration fuels industrialization. And the reason I say that is that industrialization requires cheap labor, and in many cases, cheap, unskilled labor in order to move forward. Previously in American history, we had a system. Um, if you're familiar with Johnny Tremain, the novel about the American Revolution, where the young boy is a silversmith, we have or is training to be a silversmith. We have relied in our past on a system where masters owned the means of production, generally in their house. So, like Paul Revere. Paul Revere is a silversmith. He has a shop. It's not immediately located in his shop or in his house, but it's within easy traveling distance. Um, Paul Revere is going to have people working for him that are trying to gain skills as silversmiths. He'll have apprentices, generally young boys starting about the age of maybe 9 or 10 years old, working with him up through the age of 18. Then they'll have a series of journeyman jobs, and journeymen are men who have a certain set of skills, in this case, silversmithing, but they're not masters of their trade yet. They'll spend maybe a decade traveling, working with other masters in order to gain new skills, new insights, in order to develop their own skills as a means of perfecting their trades. So early in American history, crafts and developing or manufacturing goods takes place on a very small scale where the owner is a laborer himself generally. He's overseeing the work of apprentices and journeymen underneath him, and they'll also share his roof. If in the case of an apprentice, you'll go and live with your master for that 7 year period generally, and you may not be paid a wage. It's very well a situation where he's giving you a roof, clothing. You might have a contract that requires a certain amount of access to education outside of your job, but you live with your master. He feeds you, he clothes you. You're, in essence, a member of his family. This means that manufacturing is a very small scale type of production. It's very intimate. People may, in some cases, be coming to your home to buy goods. It's it's great for a small population pre-capitalist or pre-industrial economy. Once we start getting the ability to manufacture goods on a very large scale, the first real case in American history is cotton textiles, cotton fibers. Will develop factories, and a factory is not going to be a place where generally a person is living under the house of their employer, where they are paid a certain, maybe not paid a wage, but given access to education or given food in exchange for the return of skills. In a factory situation, you sell your labor and your time for a certain wage. In this early period of industrialization, we're going to rely on immigrants by and large for this early form of labor because immigrants work cheaply. Immigrants are considered to be highly replaceable employees. There's no need to worry about health of your employee. If you're in a large town like New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, it's very much the situation. There are people waiting to have a job. And so you don't have to worry about overworking your employees. You don't have to worry about the health care of your employees, how well they're fed, if their wage is actually going to provide a fair means of living, because there's always somebody else there willing to take the job. And because of that, we move away from using native born Americans, unless they're living in these densely populated cities, as industrial employees. There is, beginning after the Civil War, we have a new stream of immigration um, that I'll describe in a second. That stream of immigrants, there's always someone new coming off the boat. There's always someone new looking for a job in these major metropolitan areas. And so wages are low, work conditions are poor, and generally, until it begins to affect the average individual in some way, that people just don't care. And that's actually dealt with in one of the readings that I don't believe I did actually assign in the book, that talks about the jungle. I don't believe the section in the jungle is discussed, but the jungle is a very important novel for this period of American history. We'll get to all that in a second. So, I just mentioned that this is a new wave of immigration. Obviously, this is a nation, we are a nation of immigrants. Very, with the exception of the indigenous population, no one was born naturally here in America. If you're a Caucasian, you came from somewhere else. If you're an African American, you came from someplace else. Your mode of immigration may be different. The basis, obviously slavery is a form of immigration that is forced and not of your own free will. But we get differentiation with immigrants, even Caucasian or white immigrants, throughout our nation's history. Obviously, the first successful colonizations along the East Coast rely on English and German settlers. And we'll have a smattering of people from across Western Europe. Believe it or not, the Swedes were very important in settling New Jersey in the 18th century. That immigration will tail off from Northern Europe. By and large, we'll rely on France, England, the Germanic states. Germany doesn't exist until really the 1870s for the bulk of our immigration. And so what we'll get as the stereotypical early acceptable immigrant is what we call the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant immigrant. They're Caucasian. Anglo-Saxon describes that Western European heritage, and they are, by and large, of the Protestant religion. One of the first big challenges to that conception of the immigrant is the Irish immigration of the 1840s and 50s based on the potato famine. The Irish were a poor country to begin with because of, at that point, I want to say nearly 400 years of English occupation and control of society and control of resources. So that the native Irishman was by and large a poor farmer, a poor farm laborer who was Catholic. When they start immigrating in the 1840s, they're seen as a direct assault on American culture. The Irishman brings alcoholism. The Irishman brings fighting, poor values. If you look at cartoon illustrations of the period, they're almost portrayed as subhuman. They all have kind of a pug nose, and yes, they're human, but there's nothing given that shows intelligence in their features. The Irish Catholic is going to destroy America as we know it. Obviously, attitudes change. Sometimes they change slowly. We'll come back to this when we discuss the middle of the 20th century. John F. Kennedy is the first Catholic candidate to successfully run for president. He has to give a speech in 1960 about how, as a Catholic, he's going to be a good president and loyal to this country and not obeyant to Rome, the Vatican, or the Catholic Church in his leadership. There's still, even in the 1960s, a belief that a Catholic can only be loyal to Rome. It sounds odd today. It doesn't sound right. But that's the type of attitude that Irish Americans and Irish Catholics had to deal with. Uh, in the 1840s through the 1860s, you can actually make the argument that Irish Catholics really aren't even seen as white people because they're poor. They bring problems with them. They are actually, when living in a slum, prone to fighting. When they're not able to find good work to support their families, they tend to drown their problems in alcohol, as do a lot of other people. So this stereotype develops in such a way that we don't see initially Irish Catholics as even being white. This will slowly fade, and one of the things that will actually help us forget about the Irish is in the 1870s, the 1880s, the locus of immigration changes. Now, as I said, the first great wave of immigration to this country was from Western Europe. Starting in the 1870s up through the turn of the 20th century, we start seeing immigration coming from Southern Europe, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Eastern Europe, the Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the Slavic states bordering the Kingdom of Russia at that time. These people are going to again challenge the nature of what is whiteness in our society. Are these immigrants white? Because they're not practicing the same type. They may look like us. They're not practicing the same type of religion. They're not. They don't have the same traditional manners or mode of dress that Western Europeans generally tend to have. They speak languages that nobody can understand. And so we're going to see a bigotry expressed towards these European immigrants as being subhuman, being less than fully white, being less than fully possible of being Americans. And these are the immigrants that are fueling our factories and coming over and working in these jobs. The reason The Jungle is such a great exemplar of this period in time is it deals with the question of both immigration and industrial labor. The Jungle is a novel set in Chicago. Some of you may have read it. It varies school to school on how many students have been exposed to it in high school or in college. In essence, Upton Sinclair is a journalist who wants to make changes to the American industrial system and the American political system. He's a socialist. And the actual goal of The Jungle is to push the idea of socialism as the cure for America's ills, especially those ills experienced by the laborers. And in order to do this, Upton Sinclair gives us a graphic view of how immigrants are treated both as they get off the boat and as they work in these factories. In Chicago, the focus city for the Jungle, we're dealing with the meatpacking plants. Chicago is the slaughterhouse to the world in the late 19th century. Its massive rail yards bring in hogs and cattle from across the interior of the United States for slaughter and production in the meatpacking warehouses. And from there, they'll be sent out as foodstuffs across the country. Sinclair gives us a horrific view of the industrial labor conditions in the late 19th century. It is smelly. Floors are covered with blood and mucus and water. and offal, the internal organs that have fallen or missed vats in these warehouses. Um, it is rat infested. People who are there that are supposed to be inspecting meat are actually taking bribes from the company owners, and they're just saying that everything's okay, and they're going to fall asleep, or they're going to go off somewhere and have a drink somewhere in the factory where they can't be found. Um, Animals will be slaughtered, sometimes cruelly, sometimes uh, they'll make their way to the cutting line still alive. Uh, Rats are slipping into the sausage vats, or if a worker cuts off his finger, he's slipping into the sausage vats, or his finger, his hand is ending up in the mix somehow, and it's brutal, it's disgusting, and it gives us a horrific picture of what labor is like working in these factories. You don't matter as a worker. You can be replaced. I don't care if you don't like what you see. If you don't like what you see, go somewhere else. Find somewhere else to make a penny. And ironically, what comes out of the jungle is our first attempts at changing how food is processed and our first federal laws about food purity. The Food and Drug Administration comes out of the jungle because that's how Teddy Roosevelt reacts to it. He's given this novel and, hey, read this book, see how disgusting everything is. And he's being mailed letters by the average people. This is what's going into our food. How can we eat this? This is going to kill Americans. So ironically, instead of creating a system where the workers' conditions are improved and factories are cleaned up and we find better ways of working and creating manufacturers, instead we get legislation on what can go into our food and that our food must be inspected. The jungle actually ends up failing in its mission, but it does draw the modern reader a good, accurate depiction of life inside factories and life for these immigrants, because this is the only work that they can truly get. And in some cases, they actually come to America to get this work because some companies will send recruiters overseas, and they'll send pamphlets that say, hey, come and work in America. The slaughterhouses of Chicago will give you magnificent wages. You'll be able to buy your own home and have your kids go to school and create a whole life that isn't possible for the poor of Europe. And unfortunately, when they get here, that situation isn't always realizable. Another immigrant group that we deal with in our readings today, in chapter 3, is if I can find this real quick, is Chinese labor, especially when it comes to building the railroads. Um, the Chinese and Asian immigration, by and large, is a West Coast phenomenon. Um, there will be threads of Chinese immigration throughout the West, but it's concentrated by and large west of the Rocky Mountains. But what we'll see is a complete unacceptance of Chinese and Asian immigrants as possible American citizens. They are great to come to bring here to work. They'll work cheaply, they'll work quietly, they won't try to resist, they won't look for a better means because they will do what they're told and work hard. Um, but again, we have a language barrier, we have a skin color barrier, we have a behavioral barrier that is impossible for the first few generations of Asian Americans to really cross over and broach their way into American society. Um, the Chinese are treated horribly on the West Coast. We'll see the rise of things like anti-Chinese leagues, people pushing to keep them in certain sectors of cities. that we need special laws to regulate what they come to call the Asian menace or the yellow menace. The Chinese worker is devious. He's not like us. He's not even a Christian. We can't trust him. We look at the way he looks, look at the way he acts. He even eats completely different food than we do, although incredibly popular food. If the rise of chop suey is an American version of Chinese food, and look how popular Chinese food has become across the country. But they'll be seen again as another wave of this immigrant menace that comes into this country. And they work hand in hand, immigration and industrialization. The Chinese are brought here to help build the railroad. The first waves of Chinese settlers in America will actually come here because of the gold rush. Unfortunately, American industry will be developed in this country during the late 19th century on the backs of immigrants who are paid poor wages, who are treated physically poorly, and who pay all too high a price for their presence in the American industrial system. In some ways, to be honest, that system's really not going to change until the mid 20th century, where unions, which are starting to rise in the latter part of the 19th century, and we'll have our first major strikes like Homestead coming out of the 1880s and 1890s. But really, unions in this country aren't going to find a successful way to mediate and improve the labor experience until the 1930s and 40s. As you go ahead, go through and read chapter 3, just keep that immigrant experience fresh and foremost in your mind. Like I said, we're all immigrants. I'm an immigrant newly to South Dakota. My family immigrated from Scotland, England, and Ireland as late as 1900. Some of your families, if I go by the stereotype for the population base of South Dakota, came here during this period, the 1870s and 1880s. The Northern European immigrant experience was maybe not as bad in some ways out on the plains because they didn't come here looking for industrial jobs. They came here because of the access to land that recruitment companies were sending out literature about, because states and territories like South Dakota, the Montana Territory, Iowa even, were sending out people to go to these European countries to bring in immigrants. The bigger our population, the better our chance to get more recognition based on population from the House of Representatives. If we become a bigger state, we'll have a bigger say. We'll develop more industry. We'll develop more infrastructure. For a lot of Northern Europeans, we see this as the chance to come to America and farm. They were farmers when they lived in Northern Europe. In many cases, that society had no land for them to expand upon, especially land for their families to expand upon. And so they would come to this country in search of good farm ground where they could especially buy enough land to guarantee their children would have farms when they passed on or became too old to work for themselves. The Northern European experience here in the Great Plains, generally the first generation immigrant, the immigrant who comes directly from Europe, actually doesn't learn to speak English. We'll have knots of population here in the Dakotas that the grandparents, and in some cases the parents, won't learn to speak English well into the 20th century. They're going to rely on their children and grandchildren who are going to go to school and be educated in the American system surrounded by American kids to learn English and act as their interpreters when they go to the store. They're going to learn how to interact for their children so that their children have a better chance of becoming an active part of the American population. What I've always found interesting, there are pro-American propaganda posters that are printed and distributed in North Dakota during the Second World War that are printed in German because there are large enough enclaves of Germans living in the Dakotas that they don't speak English at all. When they go to the store, they speak German at the store because that's what the storekeeper speaks. The immigrant experience constantly changes, but it's always a new interpretation of a very old story. Previous generations of immigrants become Americanized through one means or another. They look down on new waves of immigrants as un-American, as seemingly never going to be able to be American. They're never going to want to fit in. And it takes periods of time, but those immigrants will eventually be accepted into our culture. And then once they become Americans, the next group of immigrants comes in and they're treated poorly. They'll never be able to be Americans. Unfortunately, the immigration story in this country, if you've been watching the news, maintains that narrative even to this day. So that's it for our discussion of Chapter 3. I will be back in a couple of days. We'll have some more material. I'm in the process of catching everything up. If you have any questions about this lecture, feel free to drop me an email. You've all got that. I'll post this up on the My USF page to get this going. And there's no homework for this assignment. There will be later in the week. I hope everybody has a great day, and I'll talk to you later.